to talk about spiritual thirst. That deep pit of your stomach loneliness, longing for God and feeling nothing. Like knowing the mountaintop experience, but feeling like you are lost and in a valley. Or the experience of knowing love, knowing safety, but feeling abandoned and weary. And that the night is dark. If you are growing spiritually, you will know this dark valley. There's a name for it. The ancient mystics called it the desert, or the noche oscura del alma, the dark night of the soul. It's the place where the spirit is famished and thirsty, and you are not experiencing God. It's always the first test. This long fast in the desert. We've been talking about tests, and there are archetypally like 5 tests, but the first one always is the desert. It's always the long spiritual fast in the desert. We've been talking about tests, and when we talk about tests, we're talking about calling. Tests are not proving, performing, achieving. God doesn't care about all that. Spiritual tests are not something you pass or fail. Tests teach us the meaning of our calling. Tests point us toward the truth of what we are called to be. You are called. You are called by God. And so then you're tested. And the test, it teaches us what that calling actually means. We are called by God. We're called into sacred vocation or a sacred identity. We're called into a blessed community. We're called into the kingdom and communion with all of that kingdom. We are called by God, and most of us ignore it, of course, and we just choose to like self-define or copy, or sometimes we choose to compete, or we say yes, and when we say yes, it's awesome. It's thrilling. It's this wonderful experience of God, this experience of God. And then you're tested. You're tested. And the first of the 5 archetypal tests is the desert. When you feel suddenly and bizarrely completely alone. How strange, right? That it comes right after God calling you. God calls you. You're moved. You're thrilled. You're filled with emotion. You're worshipful and inspired and excited, feeling all the miracles. Hey, it's good to see you. I love that guy. He's one of the best. You just feel this experience where you're fully experiencing God, and then suddenly nothing. Like nothing but loneliness. This is common. It's very common. It's also common to feel ashamed of this. It's really common to try and cover it up. It's common to pretend like you're not experiencing it, but it is experienced by everyone who says yes to God's calling. Do you remember when the Hebrew people said yes to the calling of God? The Hebrew people are liberated from Egyptian slavery. They just want to get out of town, and they're following this massive pillar of cloud and fire, and they are fully experiencing the presence of God, the power of God. They're living in wonder. And then Pharaoh, in all of his fury, he decides to pursue them. And just as they come to the shores of a sea and the empire is charging across the land after them, and they've got their chariots and their tanks and their armed drones, this pillar of fire and cloud moves around the people and blocks the army, and then the ruach of God begins blowing at the water, and it shapes a path, and the liberated people are called through the dark night, through the waters. They are called, and they embrace this mystery and this wonder. They are called. It's like a baptism, to move through into a new identity, move through the water into a new identity. They say yes, and the empire's army is defeated by the waters, and now they are fully liberated. They're fully liberated, and they sing this marvelous, great song of freedom. Yahweh is my strength. Yahweh is my song. Yahweh is my salvation, my Yeshua. Hey, man. I like that guy too. Hey. It's all the friends are here. This is like this liberation song that they're singing. This is all in Exodus 15. What an experience it is. It's this really, really amazing mountaintop experience. It's wonderful. It's miraculous. And then they realize they're in the desert. Immediately after singing this incredible song, they realize they are in the desert. And they have no water. For 3 days, they have no water at all. They have experienced the most miraculous thing. And now they are thirsty and they are desperate. And then they're bitter. The whole story about this bitter experience, and they're furious. They're angry at God. They're angry at Moses. And they're wondering, why in the world did we do this? How in the world did we get here? We're famished and we are thirsty. Why did we say yes? What an absolutely disaster. This is always the first test. It's the test of the desert. You have said yes to God, and now you're in the desert. If you've done this, you know this experience. You know this desert. We just experienced God, and now we feel completely abandoned. This happened to the disciples too. It happened to the disciples of Jesus. They see Jesus transfigured in front of them. They finally get to see all of his glory. They audibly hear the voice of God calling them. And they are called, like, this is my beloved son, follow him. And they are called, and they follow down the mountain. They are called to be a participant in this miracle. They come down the mountain, and suddenly they feel, it's almost immediate, worthless. Right after coming down the mountain, they're getting into fights with each other. They feel completely powerless. They hear Jesus talk about his death and his coming suffering, and they are dominated by fear and by doubt. Even though they've just seen the most miraculous thing, they can't understand anything, and they can't communicate anymore with Jesus. Here's my stilted, very literal translation of Mark chapter 9, verse 32. The disciples felt ignorant and too anxiously afraid to seek after Jesus. They were in the desert. They were just on the mountaintop, and suddenly they are in the desert. The same thing happened to Paul, remember? He's miraculously called by Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he ends up wandering in Arabia for years. It will happen to anyone who says yes to God's calling. The desert, it's the first test of a calling. It happened to Jesus. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist. Jesus audibly hears the voice of God saying, "You are my beloved child." Jesus is called by God. So what immediately happens? He's driven into the desert. He's driven into the desert. Mark says the Spirit drives him into the desert, and for 40 days he is famished and thirsty. It's the first of the 5 sort of archetypal tests. It's the desert. You have been called, and you say yes, and suddenly you feel abandoned and alone and thirsty. Why? Why in the world? Why does God always do this? I mean, why can't we just receive a helpful manual and a step-by-step success plan? I mean, why can't we just make it a little bit easier? Why does it always happen that you say yes and then you're driven into the desert? Well, Santa Teresa de Avila and San Juan de la Cruz, these characters back in Spain, these mystics, this is like 500 years ago, they had this very mystical theory. Beautiful mystical theory. Actually, it's a highly developed theory of the noche oscura del alma, the dark night of the soul, they called it. Here's a really, really super quick summary of the why. They said, St. Teresa and St. John of the Cross, they said that if you experience God, the experience is so wondrous and powerful that we begin to pursue and seek after and worship our experience. We begin to worship our experience of God rather than worship God. We worship our experience, the feelings, the emotions, the excitement, rather than worship God. And of course, we are called not to just experience God. We are called to fully worship God. And so the mystics said, God graciously takes that experience away. God drives us into the desert. God drives us into the lack of experience of God. God drives us into the loneliness and felt abandonment, not because God is not there, not because God has abandoned us, but the test takes our experience of God away so that we can be taught our true calling, what it truly means to be a beloved disciple, what it truly means to be an apostle, what it truly means to be a dedicated people. Here's a really, really rough analogy. A rough analogy could be human sexuality. as an example, sex is this phenomenally powerful experience. It bonds two people together. It's physical, it's emotional, it's spiritual. It's this bonding, unifying, deep connection between people, two people. But what happens when someone becomes obsessed with the experience and not with their beloved? What happens when someone loves the experience of sex and not the true calling of unity and bondedness? They worship the experience instead of truly lean into the unity and the bond. Worshiping the experience, it gets you all sorts of problems. I mean, immediately you see all sorts of trouble, like in this case, promiscuity, or pornography, or violence, or sex trafficking, like awful, wretched, horrible things that come from what was originally something that is good, profoundly good, and bonding. But if you worship the experience instead of not truly loving, then it's such a disaster. Okay, back to this. Sex is a very good and powerful thing, but it does not make a marriage. And so similarly, experiencing the power and the glory and the miracles and the voice of God, that is very, very good. It's amazing. It's super emotional. And we find ourselves laughing and crying and quaking and feeling awe. But that experience does not make communion. Our experience of God does not fulfill our calling. It is good, and we need it, and it will come back. But for now, God says, learn desert silence. Learn the desert silence. Learn me waiting for you on the other side of the thirst. By the way, the mystic said, we have a choice. We have a choice when we are in the desert, when we're in the dark night of the soul. We can exit, or we can keep plodding on. The Hebrew people, they were always talking about just turning around and going back to Egypt. And you can do that. You can ask God to get you out of the desert. And the mystics say that God will honor your request and let you leave, but your spiritual development will completely halt. It will stop. The other choice is to continue on. To know that the thirst is teaching your soul. To know that the long wait is teaching your soul. Hold on. Jesus went into the desert ahead of you, and you feel completely alone and famished and purposeless, but you are not. Jesus is there with you, and the thirst is teaching your soul who you are truly called to be. Hold on. Hold on. There's this psalm, we call it Psalm 131. It's one of the ancient songs that they would sing on their pilgrimages. Psalm 131, one of the songs of ascent. It has this image in it. It has this image. I have given over my soul to silence. I've given over my soul to silence. Like a weaned child resting against my mother. My soul within me is like a weaned child. I have given over my soul to silence. I've let it wander into the desert where there is no sound, no connection, no experience, but I'm weaned. I'm weaned, which means like I can endure. I can endure. God has set me up for this. I can endure. I'm resting against a mother who teaches me who I am, who shows me who I am to be. I have given over my soul to the silence like a weaned child resting against my mother. My soul within me is like a weaned child. And then the song ends. Israel, wait for Yahweh from this time on and forever. Hold on, it says. Hold on. If you have said yes to God and you're in the desert, hold on. God has not left you. God will never leave you. So hold on. If you're looking back on a time when you were in the desert and it halted your spiritual growth and you feel like you went plunging back into Egypt, God's voice is still calling you and is still sustaining you and will still be calling you like a weaned child, leaning against your mother, the one who teaches you who you are.